Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Good morning to you, Hawaii, Beijing, Tokyo, and Moscow. And also my greetings to ladies and gentlemen and my dear fellow colleagues and all the audiences on YouTube online. I am Jung, the Vice Head of HK+ National Strategies Research Project Agency for National Research Foundation of Korea at Center for International Area Studies in Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. I feel it my honor to take the role of chairman in this meaningful international conference. This conference is co-hosted by Korea Environment Institute and HK+ Research Agency. Actually, we co-hosted an international conference last year on December the 1st of 2020 under the title of Seeking Supranational Cooperation for the Sustainable Development of the Korean Peninsula. Some of today's participants joined the conference too, and glad to see you, Dr. Jones, again. And I would like to express my special thanks to Dr. Lukonin, as it is 4 o'clock in the morning in Moscow. It is not easy to wake up in the morning and join the conference, but Dr. Lukonin gladly accepted our offer, and he is with us now. Thank you again. And this year's title is Border and Environment, Supranational Cooperation and Communication for Reaching Carbon Neutrality. We have 4 presenters and 4 discussants from 5 different countries today. And let me introduce them one by one briefly. And if you want to know them more precisely, you can find their resume at the profile book, which was distributed at the reception when you registered. The first presenter is Rhys Jones from University of Hawaii. He will present under the title, The Border Wall on the Korean Peninsula in Global Context. Good morning, Dr. Jones.
Good morning.
Okay. The second presenter is Dr. Wang Hongxia from Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. The title of Dr. Wang's article is China's Low Carbon Economy, Trends and Outlook. 你好.
Good morning, everyone.
The third presenter is Dr. Sergey Lukonin from Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. The title of Dr. Lukonin's article is Environmental Agenda and Practice of Using ESG Criteria in Russia. Good morning, Dr. Lukonin.
Good morning, dear colleagues.
The last presenter is Dr. Sebastian Maslow from Sendai Shirayuri Women's College. Dr. Maslow will present under the title, Japan's Energy and Climate Change Policy, Domestic and International Initiatives Towards a Carbon Neutral Society. Good morning, Dr. Maslow.
Good morning from Japan.
Yep, we have such various topics today, and I'm sure that it will give us a chance to think of the carbon neutrality and future cooperation of the global society for reaching carbon neutrality. We have 4 discussants. First of all, Jinhyoung from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good morning, Dr. Kim. And Shim Chang-Sub from Korean Environment Institute. Good morning. Kwang from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. And Lee Seung-hee from Gyeonggi University. Okay, thank you. Owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, we have no way but to have online conference like this today, but I don't think it will dampen the ideas and insights of my dear fellow colleagues. When it comes to the presentation order, Dr. Wang would be the first, and Dr. Jones, Dr. Lukonin, and Dr. Maslow. As Dr. Wang was suddenly called by the Communist Party yesterday to join a special meeting today, it would be better for her to be the first presenter. After presentation, I'll give some minutes for discussants to raise questions and make comments. And after Dr. Wang leaves, we can listen to 3 presenters' presentation one by one, and then we can have a chance of discussion altogether. I will give 20 minutes to each presenter for the presentation, and the discussants can have 10 minutes. We don't have designated discussant today, so you can freely express your opinion regarding the topic. And please be sure to keep time. I'll give you an allot when you have just 5 minutes to go, like this. Okay, so let Dr. Wang present first. After the first presentation and discussion, the presenters are asked to present one by one. And after all the presentations have made, the discussants can take their part. And after that, I will give 5 minutes to each presenter to answer the questions and comments of the discussants, and I will wrap up the session. Thank you. So I think it would be better we start now. I give the mic to the first presenter, Dr. Wang, please.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here, and thanks Chairman, and thank you everyone. I think I can share my computer screen. I have a PPT. Do you need it?
We can hear you. We can hear you. Thank you.
I can share. Okay. How to share?
Okay, Dr. Wang, you can go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. I'll share my screen. Okay. Is it okay?
Okay, we can see it.
Okay. Thank you. My presentation is on China's low carbon economy. I want to give some trends and outlook from my viewpoint. My presentation including 4 parts. First, I want to give some brief introduction. Then, I want to talk about the current situation of China's carbon emissions. And then China's low carbon transition and the feature of the transition process. And the last one is the development trends and prospects of China's low carbon economy. And firstly, I want to give some brief introduction. As we know, and now we are facing the very big challenges from climate change. And carbon dioxide emission peak and carbon neutrality is our common tasks. On September 22, 2020, China proposed at the United Nations General Assembly that China's carbon emission should strive to reach a peak before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. And as we know, yesterday, at the end of COP26, we have many issues about this carbon emission. For example, the goal of 1.5 live and so on. I think this is very important background for our low carbon economic development. And how about China's today's carbon emission? I want to give some pictures. Now we can see that current state of our China's carbon emissions. In general, China's total carbon emissions in 2020 was about 9 billion tons, accounting for about 13% of global carbon emissions. As this data from the BP, the newest data they issued on July 2021. And we can see that China now accounts about 30%, and we are the largest emitter. And the other countries, for example, the United States, about 13, and other countries, the most of about a low 10, 13. 10%. And from the total carbon emissions by country from 1980 to 2020, we can see that about China is also the largest carbon emitters. Especially, you can see that from about 2004 or 2005, we are the largest one than the United States. And cumulatively, the United States has emitted almost twice as much carbon as China. So if we totally count the carbon emission since 1950. And this data is from the CAN, the carbon brief. We can see that the United States is the largest emitter in the world since 1950. And from the perspective of the per capita carbon emissions, we can see that China is a huge country of, we are a huge country of about 1.4 billion people. So this large population makes sense that it would emit more than small nation overall. But by the index of emissions per capita, the average our person emits quite a bit less than the average America. You can see that from the figure 3, we can find that China per capita carbon emission is about 7 tons per person, but the United States and the Russia and the South Korea and the Japan are also higher, and German higher than China by the index of per capita carbon emission. And by the carbon intensity, we can see that China's carbon emission per unit GDP in 2020 is about 6.7 metric tons per 10,000 US dollars, which is about the world average. We can see China is here, and the world is here. And this is about many countries in the world. And the current state of carbon emissions structure of China, we can see that China's emissions mainly come from the second industry sector. We can see that this is our 3 industry. The primary industry, the secondary industry, and the tertiary industry. We can find that the second industry sector is our main emitters. At present, the share of carbon emission in the secondary industry is about still around about 18.4%. It's very large and high. And secondly, I want to talk about China's low carbon transition and its features. China's low carbon transition process, if we along the policy timeline, we can find that very clearly. We can put them in 3 stages. The first is the extensive development stage before 1997. And the second is from 1997 to 2010, the stage of rapid growth of carbon emission with the energy saving and emission reduction governance. And the third stage is since 2011 as a stage of comprehensive carbon emission reduction. We can see very clearly from this picture the trends of China's energy intensity, carbon intensity, and carbon emission per capita from 1918 to 2020. We can see the three stages of our carbon emission transition process. It's very clearly. And the calculus of China's low carbon transition, we can draw a conclusion that the following features. First is the growth rate of total carbon emission and the level of per capita carbon emission have been significantly controlled in recent years by the growth rate per annum from 2009 to 2019. We can find that during this period, China, the carbon growth rate per annum is about 2.43%. It's a bit higher than the total world average, but it's lower than the India and some countries. And since 2013, we can find that China's per capita carbon emissions level have been effectively controlled. You can, from the carbon emission per capita, you can find that since 2013, this index is mainly maintained at the same level. And especially since 2018, we can find that the annual growth rate of per capita carbon emission has shown clear downward trend. We can see from the picture, the figure 9, we can find that this very clearly. And second, we found that China's carbon emission intensity has declined faster than that of the world average since 2004. By this index, we can see that very clearly. You can find that the annual growth rate of carbon emission intensity trace since 1991 to 2018. This data from the World Bank. We can find China is low here. We low the world average, and we low the East Asia Pacific and middle income country. And thirdly, China's energy consumption structure has been rapidly optimized since 2011, but is still dominated by fossil energy. We can see this by the figure 11, the proportion to total energy consumption. We can find that even at the end of 2019, China's coal consumption accounts for about 57.7% of total energy consumption, although it's decreased compared to 2011. Overall, the proportion of fossil energy such as coal and oil in China's energy consumption is still as high as about 76.6%, and this is very high. If we analyze it by the electricity production, we can find that the coal-based thermal power generation provides about 64.7% of the current electricity energy in China. We can see this from the figure 12. Our power generation by source, we can find the coal is very important. Finally, our industrial structure adjustments, energy consumption structure, and decline in energy intensity are all important factors that promote China's low carbon process. And in addition, we found that the technical innovations and the slowdown in China's economic growth since 2011 has also reduced the growth of carbon emission to a certain extent and to promote the process of our carbon reduction. And now I want to talk about briefly the development trends and purpose of our China's low carbon economy. China's low carbon economic policy focuses on carbon intensity control and supplements total carbon emission control. This is proposed in our 14th five-year plan. And some trends, I think that first is it will be a low carbon economy based on optimization and adjustment of the national economic structure and industrial structure. This can maybe shows in the following. The first is low carbon development of national economic development mode will be changed during our carbon reduction process. We have proposed take the reduction of energy consumption and carbon emission per unit of GDP as indicator constraints in our GDP tasks. And I think this is very important for our carbon deduction process. And second is optimize and adjust the industrial structure to promote low carbon development. We will see that the promote the optimization of the industrial structure, and we maybe this is a very important process for us to achieve low carbon development. You can see that our share of contribution to the three structures of industry and the carbon emissions industry commission, compare these two figures, we can find that maybe the secondary industry is our carbon reduction is a very important sector for our carbon reduction. And the third, we think that the control carbon emissions from sector that are the main direct source of carbon emissions, and to promote low carbon development in the industrial sector. This is more important, especially in our manufacturing industry sectors. We can see the total energy consumption by sector. The manufacturer is our main source of the carbon emissions. And this is in detail industry, we can find the sub-industry of promotions to total energy consumption in manufacturing industry. And the second trend maybe is that energy structure optimization and low carbon economic development based on energy consumption and needs. Low carbon development along the source of energy use maybe is very easy for us to carbon reduction. To control carbon emissions in the fields of energy use. Now we are adjust our energy structure. We have proposed some goals. For example, by 2025, our carbon emissions per unit of GDP will reduce by 18% compared to 2000 to now. and to the proportion of non-fossil energy consumption will reach about 20%, and so on. You can find in my paper in details. And by 2025 and 2030, we all propose our goals of carbon reduction in energy consumption adjustment and so on. And the second is low carbon development along the source of energy use technologically. This means that we are control and reduce carbon emissions and promotes the development of low carbon economy by the technological routes of carbon emissions, including clean energy use and technical innovation of carbon emissions. The clean energy use, now we can see that China's industry sector are improve our new clean energy use, including wind, solar, and especially our new energy vehicles or our wind power and photovoltaic power generation equipment manufacturing industry now is world's most complete industry chain. This is very clear trends. And low carbon economy is a way of production and way of life. So the third trend, also the last one, is to comprehensively promote green and low carbon development. We are to establish a carbon reduction ecosystem for production and life, and set up a low carbon economy systematically. We can see that we have proposed some key areas of China's low carbon economy, including production, circulation, consumption, green infrastructure system, and green technology innovation system. We are doing our carbon reduction process in every field, including energy structure adjustment, emission reduction in key areas, financial emission reduction support, technical carbon innovation, and ecological carbon sequestration. And this is my point of view, and welcome comments. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. Thank you, Dr. Wang. Okay, thank you for keeping the time. And we could understand China's efforts to decreasing the carbon emission. And I will give a mic to discussants. All of you can have 10 minutes, so each of you can have 2 or 3 minutes. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, Dr. Kim from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies.
Hi, Professor Wang. I'm Jinhyoung Kim, HK Research Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. First of all, I'd like to thank to project investigator Professor Kwang, Jinhyoung, and KEI for organizing prominent scholar and researcher with timely topic and issue. All right, regarding to the article of Professor Wang, titled Chinese Low Carbon Economy, it suggests that transformation of economic structure in China would contribute to decreasing carbon-related emissions and activities, which is promising for the future of both domestic and global ecosystem. I have largely 2 questions. As many experts might concern, China's effort to reduce carbon emission would influence more on global supply chain than the current, especially for coal-based sectors such as urea solution currently in Korea and ship transportation, right? But I would support China's governmental commitment to carbon neutral economy because we might argue that constraint or shock to global supply can facilitate innovation for environmental friendly alternatives. At this moment, my first question is that, do you know and introduce any governmental efforts or implementation already to develop new innovative technology toward carbon neutral economy. For example, any advanced nuclear reactor or any alternatives for coal-related industries. And I'm wondering how the central government and you as an economist might consider impact of carbon neutral economy related policies on China's domestic manufacturing sector, such as localized job losses. Some might argue that it would hurt local manufacturing sector more than we expect, kind of job lost. There might be huge gap between secondary sector and technological sector jobs in terms of job qualifications. Any government plan for that? Of course, I agree with China's overall economic structure is transforming from secondary to tertiary-based economy. But if we consider spatial differences, if we look at differences among three economic regions, Western and Central regions of China are still based on secondary industry. And in addition to, there are lots of construction of urban area. In addition to economic foundation to connect with more advanced regions or economy. My second question is that, are there governmental efforts or policies to minimize localized job losses from the enhanced government priority to carbon neutral or green economy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kim. And any other questions? No questions? Okay. Then, Dr. Wang, would you answer briefly to Dr. Kim's question, please?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Kang. And I think I can answer simply about two of your questions. The first, I think you have talked about now we have many trends in technology innovation in carbon reduction or energy use. And I think in China, as according to our research, we know that we have many we have many efforts in the technology innovation in those fields. And about the nuclear, new power, or others, I think this is as usual our technology innovation goes on very well, and according in our economic fields, we know that the trends in technology innovation in solar power and in wind power, and also such as solar and wind power related industries. This is our market. The market important. Yeah, this is what the most most popular by our market by the market funds or our or others capitals or other or other things. They are putting more about on the now wind, the solar, and including and this new energy news and the new energy technology technology innovation. And this is about today's trends in technology innovation now in China. And we have also many industry policies to stimulate this industry to develop. We have set up many funds, and we have proposed many policies to encourage our firms to develop such new energy use. And this is the first answer. This is the first to your first question. And the second, I think I can give a simple answer about, as you have mentioned, during the adjustment of our energy consumption structure and the carbon emission structure adjustment, it is inevitable that maybe it will hurt the secondary industry, or it will hurt the secondary the manufacturing industry development. That's why I emphasized we must maintain our industry structure at a level of very better structure to maintain our economic development. So this is a very I think this is not an easy task for our government to maintain a better industry structure. At the same time, we can reduction our carbon emission very quickly. This task is very is not very easy. I think this is true in today's China. And as to if it hurts our local jobs or others, I think this is not very clear in today's China's employment market and our macroeconomic development, because as I have shown in my presentation, today China's industry structure now is changing into the third sector, the third industry, as the main support of our economic growth. So now our third service sector has large employment, has large jobs for our economy. So I think this is to some extent help our adjustment of our industry adjustment during the carbon reduction process. And we also have much more policies to maintain local jobs, especially to maintain our medium and small enterprises to have a better market development. This is very true. It is very important for local government and our central government to maintain our industry structure is very healthy and sustainable to maintain our economic development. At the same time, we can achieve our our carbon reduction as well. This is my simple answer. I think I don't know whether to answer your question.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. Well, it was an interesting topic, and we are really sorry to let you go now, but we know that you have a special meeting for Communist Party. So thank you again for your presentation and answer to the questions raised by Dr. Kim, and we will contact you via email after the session. Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Okay, the second presenter is Dr. Rhys Jones from University of Hawaii at Manoa, and his title is The Border Wall on the Korean Peninsula in Global Context. I'm really looking forward to listening to Dr. Jones' presentation because we know that we live in a quite certain atmosphere that divided Korea. So, please, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to join this conference again this year. I had a really enjoyable and informative time last year at the conference, and I'm happy to be back. I do wish I could be there in person. So maybe in a future iteration, we'll finally get past the COVID challenges that we're facing, and we can be there together. But today I'm coming to you from Honolulu. So. What I'm going to do today is, so while Dr. Wang talked about the carbon neutrality part of the conference theme, I'm going to focus more on the borders part of it. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the border walls around the world, which is something that I've been doing research on for a number of years. And so I'm going to share that work with you today. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll start out by giving an overview of the turn to border walls that we've seen in countries around the world. So there's, of course, a barrier on the Korean Peninsula, but there are dozens more of these border walls that have been built in the last few years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the geography of that. Then I'll spend the middle part of the talk talking about the changing purpose of borders over the last few centuries, really take a broader historical view, but to explain why so many countries are building walls right now, and really the negative impact that'll have on our ability to do cross-border cooperation. Because as the theme of this conference suggests, we're at a moment where we need to work together, to come together at a regional and a global scale to address issues around the environment, but also immigration and economic issues. But instead, we're seeing a lot of countries focusing on divisions and putting up more walls on their borders. And then briefly at the end, I'll put the wall on the Korean Peninsula into this global context and think about how it's actually quite different in purpose than most other border walls that have been built in the last few years. And during the presentation, I'll talk about how it's distinct. So a lot of countries around the world have been expanding their infrastructure at borders. This has meant more border agents at the border. This has meant new surveillance technologies at borders. It means a lot more security officials at borders. But probably the best way to visualize the turn to hardened borders globally is through the construction of walls. So in my own research, I've done work in the US-Mexico border. This is a picture near El Paso, Texas, that I took of the border wall the US built in 2007 and 2008, prior to Donald Trump's efforts to build border walls. But the US is not alone in building a border wall in the last few years. Countries around the world have been doing the same thing. In Israel, Israel has walls on most of its borders that it's built with different countries. This is a picture I took near Bethlehem a few years ago of the wall construction there. Turkey has been building extensive border walls on its border with Syria. Greece has a new border wall that it built on its border with Turkey. In fact, many of the countries in Europe have been building border walls. Probably you've been following the news just this week about the things happening on the border with Poland and Belarus, where there's a dispute about migration, and there's been talk of building even more border walls there. But countries like Hungary have been building border walls. This is the border with Serbia. Spain has border walls on its border with Morocco. A lot of people aren't aware that Spain has two enclaves in Africa, Spanish cities on the African continent, and they have walls all around those cities. Even a country like Norway has built a border wall in the last few years. So it really is a global turn towards the construction of walls. So with a colleague at the University of Quebec at Montreal, Elizabeth Vallée, and some of her students, Zoe Barry and Jocelyn Guillarmou, we calculated how many border walls there are around the world. And what we see is a really recent trend. At the end of World War II, there were about 5 border walls anywhere in the world. And even through the year 2000, so if you look somewhere right around here, there are about 15 border walls in the world. Whereas today there's 70 of these border walls. So 3/4 of the walls that have been built around the world were built in the last 20 years. And so there's been this kind of really dramatic turn towards building walls and borders. Just a few weeks ago, the Deutsche Welle, the German news source, put together a chart kind of showing where these different walls are in different places around the world. And so you can get a sense of it here. Every continent but Antarctica and Australia have border walls of some kind. They're throughout Asia, Africa, the Middle East, a lot in Europe, and even a few in South America, which has relatively few compared to other places. So what my work has looked at over the last decade is to think about why countries are building these border walls, and then what impact do the walls have on people who encounter them. So I had a book called Border Walls that came out in 2012 and Violent Borders in 2016. What I argue about walls is that they're increasingly used in a symbolic way. Because scholars have demonstrated over and over again that walls are not really that effective at stopping movement through a border space. People can go around them. People can go over them with a ladder if they're not guarded at all times. They can go under them with tunnels. At the US-Mexico border, for example, the Border Patrol has found over 250 tunnels under the wall there in the last 20 years. Similarly, there is an extensive network of tunnels under the Korean DMZ as well. So what scholars have said is that for the most part, these walls are more performative. They are a symbolic act on the part of politicians to demonstrate that they're doing something about these issues that are happening at borders. So they become the place for contested performances of territorial control, of separation, of identity, of who belongs on one side or the other. But they're also places where we see protests and resistance as well. And so I talk about all these issues in my book. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about why all these walls are being built right now. What is it that's changed about the purpose of borders that has led to this increase in construction of walls today? So to do that, I'm going to read to you a pretty long quote from a scholar named James C. Scott, where he talks about the changing state system over the last few thousand years, really. And I'm going to read that to you because I think that the purpose of the changes of borders is related to that. Because as states have changed purposes, so have the ways that they've understood their borders. So Scott says, this is from his book, The Art of Not Being Governed, which looks at Southeast Asia. But he says, in the broad sweep of history, you can think of first a stateless era, where there are no countries anywhere in the world, right? And this is the longest period of human history, where there are no large state structures. Then second, there's an era of small-scale states encircled by vast and easily reached peripheries. So states are starting to form, but they're not bumping up against each other, and the edges of the land that they control isn't really that significant. A third period is a period where those spaces between the states are shrunken and beleaguered by the expansion of state power. And then finally, he describes a period of administered space. And so that would be really just the period after World War II, where all of the land in the world is assigned to a particular country, and borders between them become fairly fixed. So my contribution to this story has been to argue how the purpose of borders has changed through these different periods. And so what I've argued in my work is that the oldest purpose of a border is as a military defensive line. So this is probably best visualized with the Great Walls of China or medieval city walls. So this is from that earlier period before the state was kind of the dominant political form and before we had global political maps to describe the locations of different states. So in this previous era, the military lines era, there wasn't an agreement between different groups about who controlled territory. Instead, states would expand out and take more territory if they could, but then they'd get pushed back if they couldn't control that space. At the same time, outside groups might raid into their lands to take their resources. So we see a lot of walls built during this period of time as ways to protect those resources from the threat of invasion. So you can think of the Great Walls of China, which were meant to stop raids by horseback people coming from the north, or medieval city walls as a similar thing that protected resources in a particular place. That starts to change in the 1600s, when in Europe, there becomes a different system for organizing political territory. Scholars often connect this to the Peace of Westphalia. It's also closely tied to the advances in cartography that allow humans to visualize the world from above, and to draw a map and then to draw a border on that map. So what we see in this new era is that instead of going to war with each other over territory, countries start to agree on a borderline, and say everything on that side is yours, everything on this side is mine. I agree not to go over there if you agree not to come over here, right? So borders become this marker of different political systems. This system culminates with the creation of the United Nations, right? So the United Nations serves as a clearinghouse for global claims of sovereignty and borders. So when a country joins the UN, they agree to respect the borders of all of the other countries that are members of the UN. During this era, because of this agreement on where borders are, the need to mark a border with a wall becomes less significant. For example, if you think about the border between the United States and Canada, the United States is not worried that Canada is going to invade across that border, right? That's not the purpose that border serves anymore. Instead, it's a marker of different political, economic, and cultural systems. So we don't see many border walls during this era. The only ones that do get built during this period of time are ones like the one on the Korean Peninsula, which is a hearkening back to that older purpose of a military defensive line where an agreement over the territory isn't worked out yet. But most borders are worked out in this era, and we don't see a lot of wall construction. The walls start to be built, though, in the era of globalization. So what we start to see is by the 1970s and 1980s, as wealth has really accumulated in particular places, and population growth is happening in other parts of the world, we see a lot more pressure on movement, where people are wanting to move from poorer areas to wealthier areas of the world. And the purpose of borders starts to shift during this period to become the place to prevent these movements of the poor. And so it's during this era that I argue that we see a lot of wall construction around the world, both about controlling the threat of armed groups from entering a particular territory, like the language around terrorism, but more frequently as anti-immigration barriers, so that walls become the place to prevent the movement of the poor from coming into a particular country. So I think you can divide up the walls that we see in the world really into three types today. There are a few examples of that older military line, like the Korean DMZ, but most of the other border walls that are built today are either justified about terrorism. So for example, in Israel, you'll see that language used a lot. In the US as well, when the first border wall was built there, that was an important justification. But then secondly, we see a lot of the walls being about immigration as being kind of the key idea that's driving the construction of these walls. Okay, so let's move to the last part of the talk, and let's think a little bit about how the border wall on the DMZ fits into that global context. And I've already kind of suggested the answer to that. So you all, of course, are familiar with the Demilitarized Zone that runs from the West Sea to the East Sea, across the Korean Peninsula. It's a zone that's 250 kilometers long. It's established, of course, in June 1953 with the Armistice Agreement, but it's not an agreed upon border, right? So it's not like all of the other borders that are being established during this period of time, where the countries on both sides agree that that's the permanent line between their countries. They recognize each other's sovereignty as they join the United Nations, right? So the Korean DMZ is hearkening back to that older purpose of barriers as a military line. And indeed, it's among the most militarized places in the world, right? With heavy military presence on both sides of that barrier. The DMZ fences that exist, there's barriers on both sides, as I'm sure you're all aware, razor wire, barbed wire, fencing on both sides of the border. The previous image, you could see the South Korean side. The North Korean side as well has similar sorts of infrastructure built there. The North Korean side, though, in some ways is also a hearkening back to a past purpose of a border wall, because it's in some ways akin to the Berlin Wall, in that its purpose is to keep people in rather than keeping people out, as many of the other border walls that have been built. The wall, though, on the Korean Peninsula has also been politicized. I talked about before how walls in and of themselves are not really an effective security measure, right? It's an ancient technology that there are many more modern ways to control space and territory. So it often is more of a symbol of the inside and outside space. And we see that with the way that the border wall on the Korean Peninsula has been described. Kim Il-sung in 1990 complained in a speech of the massive concrete border wall that South Korea had built on the border, which he said was 5 to 8 meters high and 19 meters thick. And that ran the entire length of the border, right? And that the South was doing this very divisive thing. Of course, no such thing exists, right? It's an imaginary wall, but nevertheless, it becomes that powerful symbol. And it's been repeated on North Korean state media 150 times that such a wall exists there on the Korean Peninsula. I think that's similar to a lot of other walls that exist, like Trump's border wall, right? That it becomes a powerful symbol of an idea rather than necessarily the functional thing on the border itself. A couple connections just to make. There are a few other examples of this defensive type of border wall that still exist. You can think of the berm between Western Sahara and Morocco as also a defensive military line where there's not an agreement on the territory, and there's a wall built on that border. Similarly, the line of control in Kashmir between India and Pakistan is from the same era and harkens back to this older purpose of a military defensive line. Okay, so in conclusion, I know I probably only have a minute or two left. We see a global trend towards these hardened and walled borders, where countries are building these massive structures on those borders to prevent movement in these areas, but often they're really functioning more as a symbol of division, a symbol of nationalism, a symbol of separation between the two sides. And so since this conference is about thinking of ways to work together on environmental issues, I think the global trend to constructing these border walls is concerning because it symbolizes increased divisions between different states, increased divisions between different people. So rather than looking to spaces for connections, borders globally have been places to put up walls between each other rather than building the bridges that we need to have going forward into the future. So thanks so much for having me and for your time. And I look forward to your questions after the other presentations.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. It's really quite interesting to listen to your presentation, and I haven't realized that there are so many border wars in the world. Well, as a Korean, we are not accustomed to the definition of a border because we just can watch the Demilitarized Zone. And even though once we lived on the peninsula, now we live in a kind of island. So when you look at the front cover of the profile book, you can see some birds which can go freely, come and go through the border. And we hope, it's really weird to see such many border walls in this era of globalization when the people go and come free. So we can have many interesting questions and comments after the presentation of others. And next presenter is Dr. Sergey Lukonin from Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. His title is Environmental Agenda and Practice of Using ESG Criteria in Russia. Please, Dr. Lukonin, thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me a floor, dear moderator. And first of all, let me express my gratitude to the organizers of such a great and very important event. And as you said earlier, I would like to talk about the environmental agenda in Russia and using the ESG criteria in Russia. First of all, I would like to talk about international agreements. Russia had joined almost all major international documents defining the global environmental agenda. Among them, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992, Russia ratified it in 1994, Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1997, Russia ratified it in 2004. Of course, the Paris Agreement of 2015, Russia, like other participating countries, signed it in 2016 and ratified it in 2019. And the last one, Declaration on Forests and Land Use, proposed at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference in November 2021. Russia also participates in a number of multilateral treaties and agreements in the field of environmental protection within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. For example, within the framework of Eurasian Economic Union, it is the agreement on the transboundary movement on hazardous waste through the customs territory of the Eurasian Economic Union, and so on. Within the Commonwealth of Independent States, it is the agreement on cooperation in the field of environmental protection and the agreement on information cooperation in the field of ecology and environmental protection, and so on. There are also a number of bilateral agreements, for example, with South Korea, agreement on the protection of migratory birds, as well as the framework agreement on cooperation in the field of environmental protection. With China, it is agreement on joint protection on forests from fires, agreement on cooperation in the joint development of forest resources, and agreement on cooperation in the field of research and use of the world ocean. With Germany, it is a framework agreement on cooperation in the field of environmental protection, as well as memorandum of understanding on cooperation between the Committee of Russian Federation for Geology and the Use of Subsurface Resources and the Federal Institute for Geological Science and Natural Resources of Germany. And even with the United States, it is framework agreement on cooperation in the field of environmental protection and natural resources. Similar treaties, agreements, protocols, and memoranda have been concluded between Russia and the United Kingdom, Belgium, Finland, Sweden, and other countries. And on the basis of supranational organizations, within the framework of international agreements, Russia participates in the implementation of some international environmental projects, for example, in the program for the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna of the Arctic Council. We have a lot of federal laws in Russia. The basic Russian national documents in the field of environmental protection is the Federal Law on Environmental Protection. Its main terms are further specified by federal laws on protection of atmospheric air, on production waste, on environmental expertise, on specially protected natural territories, and so on. One of the main Russian strategic documents in the field of environment is Environmental Safety Strategy of the Russian Federation for the period up to 2025, which involves the following tasks. The first one, reducing the level of air pollution, increasing the level of waste disposal, preventing water pollution, and improving water quality in polluted facilities, introducing innovative environmental technologies in production, as well as preserving the biological diversity of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And the last one, on November 1st, 2021, the Russian government approved a strategy for the social economic development of Russia with low greenhouse gas emissions until 2050. The priority of that strategy is to reduce in the period from 2021 to 2050 the accumulated volume of net greenhouse gas emissions in Russia to lower values in comparison with the same indicators of the European Union. It is assumed that further implementation of that strategy will allow achieving even carbon neutrality by 2060. But now a final plan of specific measures for the implementation of that strategy is still being developed. There are also several projects implemented in Russia now. For example, the National Project Ecology and the part of it two federal projects, Clean Air and Best Available Technologies. The National Project Ecology is aimed at the effective management of production and consumption waste, the elimination of unauthorized landfills, reducing the level of pollutants into the atmosphere, improving the quality of drinking water, preserving the unique water systems of Lake Baikal and Lake Teletsskaya, and so on. All sub-projects are designed until 2024 and assumes financing in the amount of about 60 billion, equivalent of about $60 billion. And in that projects involved various ministries and departments, for example, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the Ministry of Construction, Russian State Atomic Energy Corporation, Rosatom, and so on. In general, these projects provide for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, stimulate Russian business to introduce the best green technologies, and also to develop regulation of emission quotas. Considering the above, Russia officially supports the main global initiatives aimed at protecting the environment and is quite deeply integrated into the emerging global environmental legal regime. A broad environmental protection regime and a body of laws and regulations have also been formed within Russia, which establishes the main direction of the Russian environmental strategy, its specific goals and indicators, as well as responsibility for violations of Russian environmental legislations. Now I would like to talk about the obligation. Under the Kyoto Protocol, Russia has committed itself to reduce total annual greenhouse gas emissions in the period of from 2008 to 2012 by an average of 5% compared to 1990 levels. According to the data of Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, from 1991 to 2015, Russia was the world leader in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In 2015, Russia's greenhouse gas emissions from all sources were 44% lower than in 1990, and this is one of the highest reduction rates in the world. Greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector in 2015 were 99% lower than in 1990, from fuel combustion decreased by 39%, from industrial processes by 28%, and from agriculture activities by 60%. Within the framework of Paris Agreement, Russia has set a goal for itself to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to 75% relative to 1990 indicators, including taking into account the absorption capacity of forests. The structure of emissions by sector in Russia has remained relatively stable over the past decades. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions traditionally fall on the energy sector. Its share in the total volume of emissions in Russia in 2018 was about 80%, which is by 1.7 percentage points less than in 1990. The share of emissions from industry was 11%. It's by 2.1 percentage points higher than in 1990. And the share of emissions from agriculture was 5.7%, and it is 3 percentage points lower than in 1990. In general, in 2018, the volume of greenhouse gas emissions from the Russian industrial sector decreased by almost 15% compared to 1990. It means that at the first sight, it's very important, only at the first sight, Russia has exceeded its commitments under the Kyoto Protocol and, according to the most indicators, successfully fulfills its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And here is some statistical problem. I will talk about it a little bit later. Now I would like to talk about interim results. So during 1998, there was a significant decrease in greenhouse gas emissions in Russia due to the general deterioration of the economic situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, namely the degradation of industry and the disappearance of some of the Soviet industries. In 1999 to 2008, during the period of economic recovery, which took place in both production and consumptions, emissions showed steady growth, but the increase in emissions during this period was significantly lower than their reduction in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapse. In 2009, there was a decline in emissions associated with the 2008 global economic crisis affecting the Russian Federation. In 2010-2012, during the post-crisis economic recovery, emissions began to increase again. And in 2013-2014, total greenhouse gas emissions decreased somewhat again due to the negative economic situation associated with the Ukrainian crisis and the subsequent anti-Russian sanctions. In recent years, the total greenhouse gas emissions increased slightly, but in the 2090-2012, Russia has reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 4%. This is above the global average and slightly below the level of G7 countries. In general, in the period from 2000 to 2012, the Russian Federation reduced CO2 emissions faster than many countries by an average of 2.7% per year against 1.5% of the global average. However, the rate of reduction has decreased. If before the Paris Agreement in 2010-2015 they were 3.6% per year, then after it an average of 1.9%, and this was partly due to the launch of the import substitution program. I mean the development of certain types of industries on the territory of Russia. Despite the Russian participation in international treaties, a broad base of national environmental legislation, as well as the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, it seems that Russia's modern environmental policy is not sufficiently active. Since the 1990s, environmental policy has been perceived in Russia rather as a burden and sometimes as a threat to economic development. And this is most obviously shown in the national security strategy of the Russian Federation, where the development of green technologies is ranked among the main challenges and threats to the economic security of the country. Of course, primarily because that these technologies reduce the demand for raw materials mainly exported by Russia. Yes, Russia is one of the world leaders in terms of reducing many types of pollution, as well as CO2 emissions over the past 3 decades. However, this happened rather not because of the state environmental policy, but because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most of the Soviet industries simply ceased to exist, respectively, emissions of pollutants significantly decreased. Russia's industrial potential has not yet recovered, and therefore a statistical contradiction arises. Even if Russia slightly increases the rate of greenhouse gas emissions in the coming years, statistically, the general volume of greenhouse gas emissions in Russia will still be lower than in 1990, and Russia will still be able to fulfill its obligations under the Paris Agreement. Of course, some successes also were reached due to the restructuring in the Russian electric power industry. A relatively favorable energy balance have been formed with the dominance of natural gas. It's about 46%, and the high proportion of low carbon nuclear and hydropower energy, 19 and 18% respectively. This energy balance is more preferable than in most developed countries, including Germany and United States, which now consider themselves as leaders of low-carbon transformation, not to mention China and India, whose energy is traditionally based on coal. Nevertheless, Russia lags significantly behind in terms of the carbon intensity of the economy from the leading countries. Firstly, because of the high share of heat generation, and secondly, because of low energy efficiency of the economy. So in case of Russia, the main potential for reducing emissions concentrated in the field of the energy efficiency. Some positive effect we can find in the transformation of the Russian economy in 1999 to 2007. When new, more high-tech and less harmful industries appeared. There was also a renewal of such industries as metallurgy and chemical industry, the development of nuclear and hydropower, the spread of modern gas, electricity, and heat generation. But today, the environmental situation in Russia is ambiguous. On the one hand, against the global background, Russia, by some indicators, remains a relatively environmentally prosperous country. I mean, for example, the area of forests and the structure of balance of electricity production and so on. However, on the other hand, in a number of Russian regions and cities, environmental problems reached a critical level. Example of which is air pollution in a number of cities in Urals and Siberia, forest fires updating records every year, the ecological disaster in Norilsk at the end of May of 2000, 20, and so on. Yes, Russia is a party of all major environmental agreements, including the Paris Agreement, and is developing cooperation on environmental issues with partners within the Eurasian Economic Union, BRICS, and so on, as well as with the countries of the European Union. At the same time, Russia is not trying to play a leading role in these processes and does not approach environmental issues as one of the real foreign policy priorities. Passivity characterizes Russia's approach to the environmental and climate agenda, both in relations with its BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization partners and in relations with Western countries. And Russia's chairmanship in BRICS and SCO in 2012, in 2020 showed that Moscow doesn't consider ecological agenda as one of the priorities. However, the situation is gradually changing, and there is already an understanding in Russia that it is impossible to ignore the global trend of decarbonization, which directly affects the Russian economic interests. A decrease in demand for oil and gas will lead to a decrease in Russia's political and economic role in the world, seeing oil and gas remain the main Russian export positions. And this is especially actual against the background of statements by the European Union and China, the main importers of Russian energy carriers, about the creation of a green economy. Russia relies on the development of nuclear, hydro and hydrogen electric power, as well as on the expansion of the forest area. Currently, Russian Gazprom and Rosatom are studying various possibilities of exporting of production green or blue hydrogen based on Russian gas to the European Union. The expansion of the area of Russian forests will increase their absorption capacity, and on that basis, it is possible to form some kind of green financial instruments and trading by emission quotas. But now there is little concrete information in this area yet, because there are many technical limitations in Russia, and Russia is at the initial stage of the forming of environmental, social, economic policy. And only last week, the government announced the creation of special groups to prepare the economy for the global energy transition. It is promised that the operational action plan prepared by Ministry of Economy will be ready by December 15. And now I would like to talk a little bit ESG factors in Russia. It's almost the same situation with like with pollution. So ESG criteria is not widely used in Russia yet, and their implementation is only at the initial stage, and the legal environment is in the process of formation. Individual companies are trying to implement some ESG practices. However, their number is small, and until recently, the use of these criteria was more about image than about efficiency. For example, according to Deloitte CIS company study conducted in 2020, the share of Russian banks employing any ESG practices in their activities is only about 10% of their total number in Russia. And most experts agree that there is no systematic approach to the implementation of ESG practices in Russian banking sphere now. The Central Bank of Russia confirms that so far the main focus of attention of banking sector regulators is not ESG practices in general, but proper assessment of financial risk. Any deals linked to ESG indicators are also not very common, but there are some examples. For example, the interest rate of Russian bank Sberbank credit line to Russian corporation Sistema for about $150 million is tied to conditions such as company's approval of environmental policy and the integration of ESG principles into the investment processes and business model. Currently, Citibank is working on a number of Russian deals containing ESG indicators. One of the Russian rating agencies evaluates Russian companies for the use of ESG practices and assigns a rating, and there are more than 130 such companies from 24 different areas in Russia. Now I would like to talk about the possible cooperation between Russia and South Korea. Of course, South Korea is one of the world leaders in building a green economy and in everything related to it. And it is obvious that Russia lags far behind South Korea, both in the field of green development methodology and in the field of green technologies. And here I see the broad potential prospects for cooperation between our countries. For example, these prospects can be realized within the renewed South Korean northern policy. And Russia is also extremely interested in this order to balance the growing economic and technological influence of China and to avoid over-dependence on China. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lukonin. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lukonin, for your interesting presentation. As a big energy exporting country, it's not easy for Russia to cope with the carbon emission problems. And actually, we Koreans have dreamed of importing Russian natural gas directly through gas pipeline, but owing to the difficulties made by North Korea, it is not impossible yet, but I hope someday we can have your natural gases to reduce our carbon emission. And okay, so, well, you have waited for a long time, Dr. Sebastian Maslow, and last presenter. And Sebastian Maslow is from Sendai, Shirayuri Women's College in Japan, and his title is Japan's Energy and Climate Change Policy, Domestic and International Initiatives Towards a Carbon Neutral Society. Okay, please, Dr. Maslow.
Good morning from Japan. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and most of all, thank you for having me today with you and to let me join today's discussion. As was noted in the introductory remarks, as we are in the final days of the COP26 global climate talks, in my presentation today, I will take this as an opportunity to highlight some of the more recent changes in Japan's energy and climate policies. Across the domestic and global political divide, I will focus on the critical junctures in Japan's climate and energy policies to highlight who determines the direction of policy change in Japan towards these issues. Finally, I will briefly discuss past and prospective roles of regional environmentalism to address the current climate crisis. Right. Before I go into details, here's what I try to argue today. First, Japan's climate policy is framed in terms of a debate on energy efficiency and industrial growth. Second, and for that reason, Japan does not at this moment play a leading role in global climate politics. Third, 2020, however, has marked somewhat of a juncture at which Japan has moved towards a more active role in global climate politics. And fourth, as climate crisis becomes more securitized, future regional dynamics on climate action will be determined by geostrategic competition over shaping regional orders. As such, climate politics will likely play a more important role in regional strategies such as the free and open Indo-Pacific or Quad. So these are the core arguments of my presentation today, just in case I'm running out of time so you know what your takeaway from my presentation will be. To make sense of these arguments, let me first provide you with some context. We have seen similar data during our first presentation today, but this is from a Japanese perspective. First, where does Japan stand internationally in terms of its impact on global warming? Japan's greenhouse gas emissions have peaked in 2013. And are now trending towards downwards, as you can see here from this data. That said, Japan currently ranks 5th in global greenhouse gas emissions with a share of approximately 3.2%, behind China, the US, India, and Russia. So in what follows, I will try to explain what has caused this downward trend. So is this the trend, is this the result of effective government policies and a commitment to action on global climate change, or are we just witnessing a short-term trend in climate and energy policy? So this is one of the key questions I'll try to address in this presentation and the paper that will follow from here. So here's some more data you can see here. Overall, Japan and Japan's greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions in international comparison. Second, I'd like to look at some of the explanations of climate and energy policy change from a political science perspective. I'll elaborate on these various approaches in the final paper, and so therefore today I will refrain from a detailed discussion of these approaches. Suffice to say that policy change in the area of climate and energy policies is shaped by domestic and international dynamics, determined by changing relations between corporate, political, bureaucratic, epistemic communities and civil society actors. So these relations are not stable, but change over time in response to crisis events, campaigns, political change, or newly available scientific data knowledge. So let's look at the actual developments that Japan has seen in these areas. First, I'll start from a domestic policy perspective here. So Japan's triple disaster in March 2011, so that's precisely 1 decade, 10 years ago, was considered internationally and domestically as a critical juncture for Japan's energy policy. So the Fukushima crisis has triggered hope for deep transition in Japan's energy policy. But policies in the early 2000s already committed to cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. But prior to Fukushima, Japan's energy planning relied on nuclear energy and fossil fuels. So the nuclear meltdowns were considered as a juncture to push Japan towards increasing its share in renewable energies. So the impact of Fukushima on Japan's energy sector was crucial as it resulted in a sudden halt of nuclear power plants. So Japan was in a situation where it could not operate its nuclear power reactor fleet. So so that was the situation immediately after March 2011. In retrospective, however, Fukushima only triggered minor changes, despite efforts by the then ruling Democratic Party of Japan to implement decisive change through a fundamental review of Japan's energy policy. However, the impact of Fukushima on politics was extremely important for Japan's energy policy, as the disaster in itself quickly became framed not in terms of an energy crisis, but a crisis of crisis management caused by the then ruling Democratic Party. This has contributed to the DPJ's decline in popular support and its eventual defeat at the end of 2012. What followed from there was the return of the conservative Liberal Democratic Party under its leader, Abe Shinzo, who backtracked from the Democratic Party of Japan's initial policy initiatives, marking a return to nuclear energy and fossil fuel. Abe revised the emission reduction targets to 3.8% from a 2005 level, which actually means due to increased emissions between 1990 and 2005, that this is equal to a 3.1% increase from 1990 level. So climate and energy policies were placed within Abenomics, Japan's economic reform agenda, with the goal being to introduce more energy market competition and lower electricity prices to benefit Japanese producers and consumers. So environmental policy in Japan since 2012 was framed as industrial growth policy and not so much as action on global climate policies. So here's some. So the developments that I've just described are reflected here in the data on Japan's energy self-sufficiency, consumption, and supply. You find these in the book for the conference as well. Okay. Right. So let us now look at Japan's role in global climate politics. During the early 1990s, Japan accepted, as did other advanced countries, emission reduction targets, but it did so mainly in accordance with the US course. Japan insisted that it was one of the most energy efficient countries in the world, and thus it was very reluctant to accept equal percentage reduction targets. Japan has set emission reduction targets for 2000, 2008, 2012, that is the Kyoto Protocol period, and then 2012, 2020, 2030, and now 2050. Again, as I've said earlier, emission reductions were framed in terms of energy saving, with a focus on avoiding negative impact on industrial production and citizens' lives. Japanese policymakers did not discuss emission reduction targets in terms of Japan's overall contribution to fight a global climate crisis. Climate politics was thus largely shaped by economic and industrial ministries, and only after the Kyoto Protocol, within the process of negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, did we see an increased influence of environmental bureaucrats and the foreign ministry in Japan in setting Japan's global climate policy agenda. Okay. Now, let me briefly highlight some of the more recent developments under the last three administrations in Japan, that is under Abe, Suga, and the newly elected Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. So very broadly, when Abe returned to power in 2012, he abandoned the DPJ's emission reduction target of 25% by 2020 from the 1990 level, as I've said earlier, and de facto allowed for a 3% emission increase from the 1990 level. So after the Paris Agreement of 2015, the Abe government announced 26% cut in emissions by 2030. But this target is based on a 2013 level, which means that Japan's actual reduction is only 18%, and not as the number 26% would initially suggest. At the same time, under Abe, Japan renewed its commitment to nuclear energy and fossil fuel, coal in particular. So what has become clear during the Abe era is that, as I've mentioned earlier, that climate politics was advocated mostly as economic growth policy. So at the same time, the private sector has stepped up with its own initiatives, and I've mentioned a couple of these initiatives here. So not so much due to government policies, but mainly through private sector initiatives, then eventually has Japan sort of improved its overall performance when it comes to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. All right. So while the period since 2020 was mainly dominated by Japan's and the global struggle against COVID, it's worthwhile noting that the Suga administration that was formed in September 2020 was more active in reshaping Japan's posture on global politics and global climate politics. So this was mainly the result of the United States' return to the Paris Agreement under Biden, and thus the increased focus on climate politics within the US-Japan alliance framework. So even prior to Biden's election in July 2020, Japan committed itself to phasing out 100 of its old coal-fired power plants by 2013. Following Biden's election in November 2020, Toshiba, for example, announced its decision to stop taking orders for building any new coal power plants in the future. Japan in April 2020 revised its 2030 target for cutting greenhouse gas emissions to 46% from 26% on a 2013 level. It did so largely in response to pressure from the United States as world leaders met for a climate summit hosted by President Biden. So Japan's approach to a carbon neutral society after 2020 is based on a commitment to technological innovation and development, and particularly here with a focus on hydrogen. So this is sort of Japan's bet to achieve its emission cut targets. So finally, Kishida and his government that has just been recently formed this week. Climate politics and energy were important issues in the last election, but only second to public concerns about Japan's overall economic development. So within the LDP, only a few called for the end of nuclear energy, and Kishida's return or Kishida's election, in fact, means that Japan will commit itself in the future to nuclear energy and coal as primary sources for its energy supply. That said, Kishida has tried to offset its negative effects through technological developments as clean burning ammonia to be used as part of its coal-fueled power plants. Another important development under Kishida is his specific mentioning of Japan's role in facilitating climate action in Asia. So this comes as, I would argue, as climate politics is now increasingly becoming a more important area in geostrategic competition. So China is voicing, it's very articulate in pushing its own climate change agenda. And so in response is Japan and the United States as well. So we have moved away from climate politics being a science-only area of cooperation towards this issue being much more important also in geostrategic terms as well. Okay, so Japan is, as I've mentioned earlier, the world's third largest importer of fossil fuel. So while more than 46 countries at the current COP26 climate talks agreed to phase out coal, Japan did not join this pact to preserve its policy options. And this has triggered some heavy international criticism of Japan's approach to global climate politics. So media coverage has termed Japan's strategy as a big leap backwards on Japan being a laggard when it comes to action on global warming. So Japan's continued dependency on coal illustrates somewhat its shift in global climate politics from somewhat playing a more leading role, particularly during the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, towards taking a more reluctant stance with its continued commitment to coal. So this reluctant stance is the result of corporate pushback in Japan, a lack of political leadership, and a lack of regional consensus, as Japan points to China's absence from this recent pact as well. So now I've been criticizing Japan a lot, but it's worthwhile noting that Japan certainly is no outlier when it comes to the use of coal, as many other countries in Asia have similarly expressed their commitment to coal as a major part of their energy mix for the future. Okay. When we have time in the Q&A, here's some more data on Japan's shifting public opinion when it comes to climate change, nuclear energy. The only thing I'd like to point out here in this data is that domestic campaigns promoting sustainable development goals clearly had an impact on overall public awareness when it comes to climate action as well. So that's something worthwhile discussing perhaps in the Q&A. As sort of my final point in my presentation, I'd like to look a little bit on what has happened in the past when it comes to regional cooperation on environmental issues. As Reece has mentioned earlier, pollution certainly doesn't know borders, doesn't know any walls, so cooperation becomes very important. So here are some thoughts on regional dynamics. So while current bilateral sort of tensions and overall geopolitical shifts have forestalled like multilateral cooperation, particularly in Northeast Asia, it's worthwhile noting that this particular world region has a good track record when it comes to cooperation on environmental issues. And that's in spite of diplomatic tensions. So we have in the past seen mechanisms, for example, on acid rain, the East Asia acid deposition monitoring network that's still functioning between China, South Korea, and Japan. We also see the trilateral the trilateral environmental ministers meeting that has been incorporated as part of the trilateral summit meeting between South Korea, Japan, and China. And TEM remains active today in spite of continued bilateral or trilateral tensions. So there is a vital sort of track record and basis on which regional efforts to address current issues can be based on. I think that's worthwhile keeping in mind. And so while cooperation in the region has shifted towards rivalry over shaping regional orders, we know China's Belt and Road Initiative, Japan's response in terms of a free and open Indo-Pacific. I would predict that at least Japan will further emphasize climate and energy as part of its own regional strategy in terms of FOIP and Quad. And in fact, we already see an increase of references to climate cooperation within these frameworks. I think that's interesting to see that we'll see climate action, energy as a much more important part when it comes to actually promoting national strategies for regional order. And that's perhaps not necessarily a bad tendency in general. Okay, so as we've already, I guess, over time, I'll summarize and try to give you a quick outlook. So in addition to the points that I've mentioned here, so Japan sort of very, very slowly moving towards a more active international role in fighting climate politics. Japan remains mainly committed to its to nuclear energy and coal. Japan bets a lot of its energy strategy is based on technological innovation and development, and not so much of a radical shift towards renewables. So old technology remains intact, and Japan tries to sort of achieve its goals with a massive push in research and development for new technologies. So that's something worthwhile to keep in mind. And finally, I would encourage us all to have a look at what happens with regard to geostrategic competition in the region and how this affects the promotion of climate and energy policy goals in Asia and beyond. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maslow. Well, it's a kind of destiny that 3 countries have to cooperate to cope with the carbon dioxide and to reach carbon neutrality. But unfortunately, owing to the deterioration of relations between Japan and Korea and China, it's not easy to propel trilateral cooperation regarding the environment. So we hope that someday in the future, we can cooperate quite nicely to cope with the environmental problems. And we have listened to 3 presenters' insightful presentation, and now it's turn of discussants. So you can have 10 minutes for each of you. And when you raise question, don't forget to mention this question goes to Dr. Maslow, or this question goes to Dr. Jones, something like this. And from Dr. Kim, would you start? Yeah.
For Professor Lukonin.
Sorry. Okay, when you speak, you may wear off your mask just for the speakers, making our voice sound clearly. So yeah, you can wear off.
For Professor Lukonin, like other countries, environmental degradation in Russia, including carbon emission, might be associated with economic condition, right? Industrial adjustment and advancement would be a good way to carbon neutral economy. But I do not exactly know Russian economic structure, and ESG might be promising. I think that linking between ESG and banking sector would be a good way to attract companies more eco-friendly. But at the same time, measuring value, especially for non-financial assets or performance, would be difficult and might not guarantee companies' profits. Even persuading stakeholders of companies might be more difficult than it. If the Russian economy is based on energy sector, governmental objectives are also crucial. My question is, have Russian economic system have been balanced regarding to triadic relationship among primary, secondary, and tertiary industry? And how many proportion of Russian companies, especially secondary industry sector, have involved the possibilities to carbon neutral or green economy?
Okay, Dr. Kim's question goes to Dr. Lukonin, but Dr. Lukonin, please wait a little bit, and after all the discussants have raised questions, you can answer. Okay, Dr. Shim from Korea Environment Institute. Comments would be okay. Comments would be okay. Yeah, not only questions, but comments would be okay.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. And today there was very meaningful presentation among very nice presenters, including the Dr. Rhys Jones for border wall, especially for political aspect, and the other presenter giving us very useful information of each country's the efforts to deal with the carbon neutralization era. And that was also, I was very curious. And for now, instead of giving some questions, I just add some comment. In era of carbon neutralization, the neighboring country, what we are going to do now for action. And it was first very, for me, it was a little bit impressive of Japan's achievement in terms of carbon reductions, because Japan already start to reduce the CO2 emissions since a little bit 2005 since. But for Korea, we already announced, in audience may remember, we declared green growth in 2008. It was not that late, I think, but unfortunately, the Korea CO2 emissions kept continuing until, I think, 2018. We have to wait to correct the emission, statistics for 2019 or later. But that was a little bit unfortunate. That means our declaration and our goals are maybe not successful. So we, Korea government announced last year the carbon neutralization strategies 2050, and I hope we now really have to change. So there was the Dr. Maslow's presentation giving us a very large homework, I think. And now also I have to add some comments to transboundary cooperation in terms of dealing with environmental protections and also climate change reactions. First of all, we have to understand the uncertainties resulting from the energy and industrial revolution for carbon neutralization. Probably there must be some issues or problems in terms of productions and supplies for many goods and energies. So there must be some uncertainties, and I a little bit concerned about very probably tentative tensions between the countries because of that uncertainties. So I hope in that era the countries, the neighboring countries, have to more focus on the cooperation, especially each country need to have willing to continue the environmental protections and the actions against the climate crisis, because this is really essential to a matter of the surviving issues in this country. I was actually very impressive yesterday. As you know, China and also United States have some potential agreement to both actions to cooperate on climate change issues. So in that case, also the neighboring countries in East Asia also have to still focus on the future cooperations. And also, I want to emphasize to make some specific target in East Asia to deal with the upcoming problems, not the past problems, based on scientific predictions. And I'm personally focusing on the upcoming issues for now. First one is still air pollution. Air pollution is the most the transparent the air pollutant and environmental problems. And previously, we have focused to find many solutions on particulate matter pollutions in East Asia, as you know, and that has been a lot of years to cooperations. And now, China has great effort of reduce the air pollutions for particulate matter. For example, since 2000, I remember 13, and China was terrible before, but now their achievement is very impressive too. So we have that benefit after 2000, maybe 15. So Korean air quality in terms of PM 2.5 is keep decreasing. So that was a good example to each country's effort to protect the environment. But unfortunately, the ozone, the ozone pollution, is getting serious and getting worse now. This is before I explained that we have to understand the atmospheric chemistry, but it is kind of complex. But for now, the ozone level is already exceed many times the environmental standard in Korea as well, and which is a main threat of East Asian air environment, which is also announced by Chinese the scientists in 2019 and 18 as well. So the problem is we cannot block the ozone because this is gas phase. The PM can be protected like wearing the masks, but ozone cannot. So the solution is to reduce volatile organic compounds. In other words, non-methane organic compounds, which is very not easy as traditional the reductions of NOx or SOx, the nitrogen compound or sulfur compounds, because the VOC compounds consists of almost like 30, 40 chemical compounds, which is many lists to deal with, to reduce especially in industrial sectors. And another problem is VOC emissions is not only from the end of a pipe. They are leaking in the process of manufacturing industries. So which is not easy and also challenging, but China and Korea, maybe Japan, countries also having a cooperation to sharing the information to control the VOCs, which is very critical in the future. Okay. So lastly, I want to address the importance of ocean, to sharing the ocean between the neighboring countries, because there is some microplastics in the ocean. We have to deal with that. We have to monitor and deal with those kind of waste. And also, we are talking about the carbon neutralization, but we have to think about how many nuclear power increase in the future. So we don't want to take any kind of a crisis like Fukushima 2011. So considering the many plans to new build of nuclear power plants, we have to discuss to sharing the information for safety control for now. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Dr. Shim. Well, as an air expert, he, instead of making specific questions, he made the general comments regarding the environmental problems. So when it comes to the presenters, you also can raise questions regarding Dr. Shim's remarks. And now the third discussant is Dr. Lee Kwang-tae from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Please.
Hi. I'm so glad to see your face because we exchanged emails so much. So I'm really pleased you made it and really showed up. First of all, I want to make some comments and questions to Dr. Jones, and thank you for touching upon the issue of DMZ. The DMZ is, to Koreans, is a school field trip site. Every Korean must go there and see what the DMZ looks like when they were in the elementary school or in the middle school. And DMZ is, as you know, literally it's a zone, not just consists of a wall, but it already has 4 kilometers each to the North Korea and South Korea. And a lot of parts are minefields. So the Koreans have images of the DMZ with the barbed wire fencing and minefield. That scene really gives a kind of shocking to Koreans. And as all Koreans feel the DMZ as a representative of the history of the Korean War. It also reminds us of the mandatory military service that all Korean men are required to carry out. And so there are very mixed ideas and feelings. Also, it should include a kind of relief that we feel because we can feel that we are being protected by the North Korea's invasion or all sorts of atrocity or cruelty like that. Because of that, such a mixture of relief and worry may be one of the reasons that really hampered some efforts to increase the cooperation between two Koreas, like connecting the railways. There are many suggestions that we can connect the railroad from at the very southern port of the South Korea to even to Europe through the so-called Trans-Asian Railway. However, those kinds of mindset seems to be begun to be changed in Korean people's mind, because many recent movies and TV shows, TV drama series started to produce scenes that make people consider the inter-Korean border is not something impenetrable, but more like what we can cross. Let me give you an example. You may have heard of the very famous Netflix and TV and drama series 사랑의 불시착, and in English, Crash Landing on You. There, the female character came to cross the DMZ by the power of a sudden tornado while she was enjoying paragliding. Then she met a North Korean army officer, fell in love with him. Then, to keep their love, they crossed the border to south and to north, like that. So such description of the DMZ as penetrable and crossable, notwithstanding difficulties, of course, are becoming more and more frequent, and creating images of the border not as the one that protect us, but something that gives obstacles, interaction between the two Koreas. Those changing picture is probably, in my opinion, encouraged by the recent political events where the president of North and South Korea and even the Donald Trump, the president of United States, met in person several years ago. In those summits, the president purposefully demonstrated the crossing of the border, which clearly had a lot of impact on Korean people's mind. One more thing I want to mention is that there have been efforts to redefine the DMZ for the peaceful and environmental purposes. Some argue that DMZ could turn into an ecological preservation area that South and North Koreas can manage together. Others suggest that the two Koreas build a peace park or a peace city to promote the idea of peaceful coexistence, which would lead to unification ultimately. All those suggestions sound quite fancy, yet looks like they are having difficulties to be materialized. And so this is, I want to ask some questions to Dr. Jones. So the first question is, what do you think about the idea of turning the DMZ into peace park or peace city or ecological preservation zone based on your expertise on the border and wars around the world? And the second question I want to ask to Dr. Jones is, I know you are also interested in the borders in other places like Israel and India. And to me, the Indian-Pakistan relationship seems very similar with the Korean borders between South and North Korea in many aspects. Because India and Pakistan used to be one country like us. They had to undergo wars and military crashes several times, like us, and they started to build nuclear arsenals, which is now the case for North Korea. What do you think about these sets of comparison between the DMZ in the Korean Peninsula and the Indian-Pakistan border? As for Dr. Lukonin's presentation, he mentioned the Russian government and corporate efforts to reduce its carbon emission. Although it seems that the economic structure still show a strong tendency leaning toward the energy sector. And since Dr. Lukonin is also an expert to relationship between Russia and China, I want to ask him a question about the Russo-Chinese cooperation through the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. What is Russia's viewpoint about SCO's potential role for both environment and for security, especially during this U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China rivalries? It seems that Russia and China are trying to build a sort of bloc against the U.S. From the perspective of series of recent joint military exercises. Does that mean that Russia is allowing China to increase their influence in Central Asia or other places in Asia? If so, to what extent? And when it comes to Dr. Maslow's presentation, I was impressed by Dr. Maslow's argument that Japan's lowering of the carbon emission was the result of efforts made by private sector, not by the government. And Dr. Maslow also emphasized the role played by civil society and public opinion in Japan. I want to ask a question. How do you think, how strong the Japanese civil society's impact has been made on the Japan's politics, especially on the election? Japanese famous for people's trust and reliance on the existing social order. So according to your year-long personal observation and stay in Japan, how strong the civil society's efforts and voice for the environment will influence the people's mind? If so, how much? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee made 3 questions. One is about the border and cooperation between two Koreas. And the second question was about the Russo-Chinese cooperation. And the third one is as a Kaizen in Japan, as a foreign scholar in Japan, Dr. Maslow's understanding of civil society's efforts to cope with the, environmental problems to influence upon the Japanese government. Okay, and our last discussant is Dr. Lee from Gyeonggi University, and please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your informative and meaningful presentations. And my name is Seunghae in Gyeonggi University, Korea. It is so difficult to make the comment and question because I'm the last commenter. Previous people already mentioned a lot of things. Maybe my question was will be duplicate. So I have 2 questions, and one question is Dr. Jones, and the other question is Dr. Lukonin. And Dr. Jones already mentioned about the purpose and roles of the border walls. But border walls is totally different from the DMZ because DMZ has a zone. That is 4 kilometers you already mentioned. So this DMZ is very important economically, environmentally, also ecologically. So for the conservation of the DMZ, what do you think to do in priority? That's my first question. The second question is Dr. Lukonin. In Korea, we have the long history to develop the environmental technology. From 1992, that is the G7 project for 10 years. All environmental field is water treatment, and air pollution, and waste treatment, waste recycling. And second project is New Frontier project. That is another 10 years. Another 10 years is Global TOP project. That is also carried out a lot of projects related to environmental field. So we have a lot of achievement of technical problems to solve in Korea. So, and Dr. Lukonin, which field of international cooperation for environmental field between countries such as China, Japan, Korea, and Russia are important? That is my question.
Okay, so I give you chances to raise more questions if we have. Okay, no questions anymore. When it comes to the table, no floor. Okay, thank you. And then presenters can have 5 minutes per each, and we can start from Dr. Maslow as he waited so long for his presentation. So, Dr. Maslow, please.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this. I will not take my 5 minutes because I have only received one particular comment by Dr. Lee on the impact, the role of civil society in shaping Japan's sort of public opinion on climate and energy policies. Well, let me just say there's no such thing as a broad, for example, a Friday for Futures protest movement in Japan. The students would go out on the streets and demand government action. That's not what you see in Japan. That said, however, and in the presentation slides, you'll see sort of public opinion data. So, for example, in universities, I'm quite sure the same is true for South Korea, that in education, high schools, universities, there's a very strong emphasis on SDGs and implementing SDGs and engaging students in debating as sustainable development goals. That had clearly an impact on how students perceive global issues, including climate and energy. And over the last 5 to 6 years since the United Nations has initiated this, there is a shift in problem awareness, particularly among younger among students. So that's one positive development. Another aspect I would like to emphasize is that although there's no broad protest at the moment, clearly energy has become a trench line in political contestation. So every single party during the last election, previous elections, has to take a stance on what to do with regard to nuclear energy and energy in general. So that's clearly a line with regard to political contestation in Japan. And because there is a line in politics and this line is being enforced by civil society actors, this issue receives much more public attention than it has prior to Fukushima in 2011. So whatever the Kishida government or any other government that will follow him will do with regard to nuclear energy in the coming years, this will be a policy that the government will not be able to implement without any public pushback on that matter. So that's clearly a change in a positive direction. So that through nuclear energy, the entire issue of energy and what to do with energy, we had to shift Japan towards is receiving much more public attention. And nuclear energy, the question of nuclear energy, is only one facilitator in that broader debate. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next mic goes to Dr. Lukonin. Okay, Dr. Lukonin, please.
Yes, Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all your very sharp and interesting question. I would like to answer the first question about the structure of Russian economy. So it's about 60% goes to the services, about 36% goes to industry, and to agriculture goes about 4%. Of course, Russian companies perceive any activities in the field of environment and ESG practices as additional costs. But they have to do it because the main export markets have adopted quite strict environmental laws. So, as the bigger part of Russian export is oil and gas, Russian companies will implement environmental practices despite any additional costs. The next question I would like to answer is the number third, because it's quite short, about the technologies which we can develop between China, South Korea, and Russia. I think that it's energy efficient technologies in general, then waste recycling, it's very important and actual in Russia, and energy efficient houses, because the climate in Russia is quite bad. And the next question answer will be quite big about the China and Russia in the frameworks of SCO. First of all, very little attention is paid to environmental issues within the SCO. The SCO specialization is, after all, stability and security. And at the moment, the participants of SCO understand this mainly as military cooperation countering religious radicalism and terrorism. Yes, theoretically, due to the aggravation of Russian-American and Chinese-American relations, the importance of SCO at the first glance is growing. Russia and China use the SCO factor to give additional weight to their negotiation positions with the United States. And based on this, both Russia and China will strengthen the cooperation within the SCO. However, it is important to note that there are some contradictions in the organization itself. For example, the presence of several pairs of rivals in the composition of SCO, I mean China and India, or India and Pakistan. And the admission of Iran to the SCO, on the one hand, increases the political weight of the organization, but on the other hand, there can be additional problems related to Iran's independent position on many issues. And yes, at the first glance, due to the anti-Chinese and anti-Russian policies, Russia and China are strengthening cooperation. However, there are some limitations on the way to creating a full-fledged Russian-Chinese bloc. Firstly, we are partners, but not allies. Both Russia and China have repeatedly stated that allied relations can limit the room for maneuver. I very much doubt that Russia will support China in practice if a military conflict starts over Taiwan. For example, Russia did not even interfere diplomatically in the clash of on the Sino-Indian border. And by the way, the membership of China and India in the ECO also didn't contribute much to the rapid cessation of clashes. I'm sure that China will not interfere and will not support Russia in the event of a resumption of hostilities in the Ukrainian Donbass. So, in my opinion, the creation of full-fledged military bloc is still far away, but at the same time, of course, the strengthening of Russian-Chinese cooperation in various directions is certainly underway. And the third part of question about the China in Central Asia. In my opinion, the strengthening of China's political influence following the economic one in the countries of Central Asia is inevitable and does not depend on Russia's permission or not. Moreover, China actively cooperates with Central Asian countries outside the SCO framework. For example, Foreign Minister of China Wang during his visit to the Central Asia countries in July 2021, took the initiative to enhance the regional role of the new format, China plus Central Asia. And Chinese politicians and experts proceed from new realities here, noting that the expansion of the SCO at the expense of countries with mutual conflict relations, for example, India and Pakistan, as well as the adoption of Iran, which is problematic from the point of view of nuclear sense, encourages the Central Asian core of the SCO in the Chinese interpretation to seek new formats of regional cooperation and rely primarily on its own interest. But of course, although there are some obstacles to the expansion of Chinese influence in Central Asia, for example, quite strong anti-Chinese sentiments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lukonin. And lastly, please, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, first, I just want to thank the other presenters for their interesting insights to the situation in Japan and China and Russia. So thank you for those. And thanks also to the discussants for the interesting questions and points about these different topics. This has been really enjoyable to be part of. Both Drs. Lee asked me questions about border walls around the world in the DMZ. So I think both of them asked a question about the extent of the DMZ, right? That it is a zone. It's a 4 kilometer area, which is a little different than a lot of other borders around the world, but there are some other similar examples. For example, the India-Bangladesh border has a zone of 150 meters on either side of the border. That's a buffer zone in that space where neither country is supposed to build any buildings or any security infrastructure. So there are some other examples of that kind of zone rather than an actual line. And I think in a lot of borders around the world, we see that the security forces tend to work in a zone around the borders as well. So having a completely separate, closed off 4 kilometer space is certainly distinct. But at the US-Mexico border, for example, the US Border Patrol is allowed to operate in a zone within 100 miles, which is 150 kilometers from the US-Mexico border. And so in that entire area, they have the ability to search for people and detain people, set up roadblocks and things like that. So there's, I think there are different types of zones at borders, but the idea of having a zone it's a characteristic of a number of them. I thought the first Dr. Lee's comments about the way that the DMZ has transitioned in the way that people talk about it were quite interesting. Though I liked the idea that in some ways it's a field trip site for kids, that it's almost a pilgrimage that people go there to see, but that in popular culture, the idea of the DMZ and the boundary is changing in the perceptions. I've seen the first episode of Crash Landing on You, so I'm familiar with that show. And I watched it specifically because I'm interested in border issues and the ways that borders and walls are represented in popular culture. And I think that's an example of it. It reminds us that all borders are imagined lines, right? These are things that have been drawn on a map at some previous period in history, right? The very oldest border is only 500 years old, right? And 450 years old in parts of Europe, Spain and France and the Pyrenees. This is the first border drawn on a map that was agreed upon. So all the rest of the borders that we have in the world have been made since then, right? And so they're not things that have existed for time immemorial, right? They're agreements between different states to divide up land and territory, right? So they only exist to the extent that we believe that they exist, right? And that we treat them as real. And then we enact them by building things like walls on them, by putting security forces at these lines to bring them into being. So I think that shows like Crash Landing on You helps to remind us of that, right? To question the necessity of these distinctions and to keep in mind that we are people on both sides of these boundaries, right? That share the common desires and beliefs, and have a lot more in common than we do in what divides us, right? And I think we can see that today in the talk that we've been having, right? We've got people from all around the world here, right? Having this shared discussion about these issues and finding common ground, right? And so I think that holding sessions like this is really important to find these areas of agreement between people in different places, and I commend the organizers for putting this together. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, I totally agree with you that having together and cooperating together is good for the peace and prosperity for the humankind. And actually, last year in the same seminar, I mentioned that we hope that someday in the future, without this weird mask, we can meet in person and talk freely about the cooperation of us. But unfortunately, this year we have no way but to open seminar like this online. But I'm sure that next year we might be able to invite all of you to Seoul or somewhere in the world, and we can meet together and have a insightful discussion. And thank you again. And it's 12:30 in Seoul now, and maybe 6:30 in Hawaii afternoon, and 6:30 in the morning in Moscow. Really thank you for Dr. Lukonin for joining us today early in the morning. And also Dr. Maslow, thank you for joining us. And thank you all the participants, and let this be end of the session. Thank you.